There is a goal that England has never truly been able to forget, and it is not because it was beautiful. It is because it was stolen right in front of everyone's eyes, broadcast live to millions of people around the planet, and still, nobody could stop it from counting. A short man, barely 1.65 meters, standing in the biggest stadium of a World Cup, decided with his own hand the destiny of a match that carried far more weight than football itself. And even now, decades later, when you ask an English fan about that single afternoon in Mexico City, something changes in their face. Their voice tightens. Their jaw clenches just slightly. And somewhere underneath all these years, an old wound quietly reopens. This is not simply a story about a game. This is a story about a wound that crossed generations, about a moment so charged with history, pride, war, and genius that it refuses to fade away, no matter how much time passes. And to really understand why it still burns, we have to go back, past the goal itself, past the stadium, past the noise of the crowd, all the way to a time when two nations were not just rivals on a football pitch, but enemies who had recently sent young men to die for a few small islands in the freezing South Atlantic. The year was 1986, and the wounds of the Falklands War, known in Argentina as the Malvinas War, were still painfully fresh. Just 4 years earlier, in 1982, British and Argentine forces had clashed in a brief but brutal conflict over a group of islands most of the world had barely heard of until then. Hundreds of young soldiers died on both sides, ships sank into freezing waters, and an entire generation on both sides of the ocean grew up with the memory of a war that never should have happened over land so small and so far from everything. Britain won that war, decisively and quickly, and for Argentina, it was not just a military defeat. It was a national humiliation, one that fed directly into political instability, economic crisis, and a wounded sense of pride that the country was desperately trying to rebuild. So when the draw for the 1986 World Cup quarterfinals placed Argentina against England, almost nobody involved treated it as just another football match. Newspapers in both countries fanned the flames long before a single ball was kicked, framing the game as a kind of unofficial rematch, a second chance to settle something that had never really been settled, even though everyone knew, deep down, that football could never truly replace what had been lost in that war. And it was into this pressure cooker, this atmosphere thick with old grief and unspoken anger, that Diego Armando Maradona walked onto the pitch. By 1986, Maradona was already more than just a talented footballer. He was becoming something closer to a national symbol, a young man from the slums of Buenos Aires who had clawed his way up through poverty, through years of being underestimated because of his size, through comparisons and criticism, until he arrived at the peak of world football carrying the weight of an entire country's hopes on his small shoulders. Argentina needed something to be proud of again. They needed a hero who could give them back a sense of dignity after years of dictatorship, economic collapse, and military defeat. And Maradona, whether he fully understood it or not at the time, had become exactly that figure, the embodiment of a nation's desire to prove itself again on any stage it still could. Nobody, not even his most devoted admirers, could have predicted that this particular match would be remembered not primarily for a moment of pure skill, but for an act of deception so bold, so audacious, that it would still be debated furiously 40 years later in living rooms, in bars, on radio shows, in documentaries, and now, in videos just like this one. Because what happened 6 minutes into the second half of that quarterfinal still splits opinion right down the middle, still causes strangers to argue passionately over something that took less than 1 single second to unfold. The play itself began almost carelessly. An English midfielder attempted a clearance that never should have gone where it went, sending the ball looping dangerously back toward his own goal. Inside the penalty area, a scramble broke out, bodies colliding, eyes fixed upward, everyone trying to read the flight of the ball at the same instant. English goalkeeper Peter Shilton, a towering figure compared to the man standing beside him, came rushing off his line to punch the danger away, as any experienced goalkeeper would instinctively do. And right there, in that split second of chaos, Diego Maradona jumped as well, small, quick, and desperate to reach a ball that seemed destined for the goalkeeper's gloves rather than his own head. What happened next took less than 1 second, and yet it changed football history forever. Instead of using his head, which is what everyone in that stadium and everyone watching on television initially assumed had happened, Maradona subtly raised his left arm just above his own head, timing the movement so precisely, disguising it so cleverly behind the natural motion of a jump, that the ball deflected off his knuckles and looped gently over the helpless Shilton and into the net. For 1, 2, 3 full seconds, nobody in that stadium seemed entirely sure what they had just witnessed. Then the Argentine players erupted, sprinting toward Maradona in wild celebration, arms raised, disbelief and joy mixing together on their faces. Meanwhile, the English players had already begun surrounding the referee, a Tunisian official named Ali bin Nasser, screaming, gesturing furiously toward their own arms, trying desperately, and completely in vain, to explain what had actually happened. But the referee had not seen the handball. Neither had his assistant, positioned on the exact same line as the play but somehow equally unable to catch what the cameras would soon reveal with brutal, undeniable clarity. Without hesitation, bin Nasser pointed toward the center circle. The goal stood. And in that instant, one of the most controversial moments in the history of world sport had just been born, a goal that would be remembered not for grace or technique, but for the sheer audacity of deceiving an entire stadium, an entire broadcast audience, and an entire sporting institution, all within the space of a single heartbeat. Television replays, shown again and again around the world within minutes, left absolutely no room for doubt. The ball had clearly struck Maradona's hand, not his head. Commentators in England, initially confused, grew increasingly furious as the truth became impossible to deny. And yet, incredibly, the goal remained on the scoreboard, an official part of football history, sanctioned by the very rules that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of injustice from ever standing. What makes this story so endlessly fascinating, so impossible to simply file away as just another controversial call, is what happened only a few minutes later on that very same pitch. As though fate itself wanted to prove a point, wanted to show the world that the very same man capable of one of football's most notorious deceptions was also capable of producing one of the greatest moments of individual brilliance the sport has ever witnessed. Maradona received the ball again, this time deep in his own half, nowhere near the English goal. What followed has since been studied, replayed, and celebrated so many times that it has practically become its own separate legend within the legend. Maradona turned, accelerated, and simply began running. He beat one English midfielder with a sudden change of direction. He beat a second player with nothing more than pure acceleration. He cut inside, drawing defenders toward him like a magnet, leaving two more England players stumbling and grasping at empty air behind him. He reached the edge of the penalty area still in full stride, faced Peter Shilton one final time, this time with no controversy required, no deception needed, just pure, devastating skill, and calmly slid the ball past the helpless goalkeeper and into the net. 60 yards. 10 seconds. 4 England players beaten along the way, including the goalkeeper. To this day, that goal is regularly voted the greatest individual goal ever scored in the history of the World Cup, sometimes the greatest goal ever scored in football, period. 2 goals. 5 minutes apart from each other. One stolen, using a hand disguised as a header, later nicknamed by Maradona himself, with a mixture of irony and defiance, as the hand of God. The other, an almost impossible display of individual genius that the world would come to know simply as the goal of the century. And it is precisely this unbearable, unresolved contradiction that turns this single football match into something far larger than a simple result on a scoreboard. Because how exactly are you supposed to feel about a man who cheats his way to one goal, and then, only minutes later, delivers arguably the single greatest piece of individual skill that sport has ever produced? How is an entire nation supposed to process pride and fury simultaneously, cheering wildly for the very same player who had just humiliated their own football team not once, but twice, in 2 entirely different ways? This contradiction was never cleanly resolved, not then, and honestly, not now either, and perhaps that is exactly why this story refuses to fade quietly into the past. It has no simple villain. It has no tidy moral lesson. And it certainly has no ending capable of satisfying both sides equally, even after 40 full years. For English fans and players alike, that afternoon in Mexico City was never simply about losing a football match, no matter how important that match happened to be. It was about something deeper, something rawer, the specific, helpless feeling of watching your own fate be decided by outright deception, in full view of millions of witnesses, and still being utterly powerless to change the outcome. Peter Shilton himself would spend years afterwards speaking about that moment, about the frustration of knowing exactly what had happened in real time, and being unable to convince a single official standing right there on the pitch. England were eliminated from that tournament that very day, ending their World Cup dream in the cruelest possible fashion. Argentina, carried onward by the momentum of Maradona's extraordinary performance, continued marching through the tournament, eventually lifting the World Cup trophy itself only a few weeks later, right there on Mexican soil, cementing Maradona's position, for many observers, as the single greatest football player the world had ever produced, a status that remains hotly debated to this very day. For Argentine fans, however, and especially for Maradona himself, that handball goal was never something to be quietly ashamed of. Quite the opposite. In interview after interview over the following decades, Maradona defended that moment, sometimes playfully, sometimes almost defiantly, framing it as a form of symbolic revenge, a small, sweet act of sporting justice delivered against a country that had recently defeated Argentina in a war that had cost so many young lives. He rarely, if ever, offered anything resembling a sincere apology, and remarkably, this refusal to fully repent never damaged his reputation back home. If anything, it strengthened the myth surrounding him even further, transforming Maradona into a living symbol of resistance, cleverness triumphing over perceived British arrogance, proof that a small man from the slums of Buenos Aires could outwit not just individual opponents, but an entire sporting system that had always, in the eyes of many Argentines, quietly favored the powerful and the privileged. And this is exactly why the controversy has never truly faded away, why it still resurfaces every single time these two nations meet on a football pitch, why British newspapers still reference it whenever Argentina appears in a major tournament draw. This was never simply a refereeing mistake, the kind of error football produces and forgets within a matter of weeks. This was a symbol, dense with history, dense with unresolved politics, dense with wounded national pride, and dense with breathtaking individual genius, all packed impossibly tightly into a single 5-minute stretch of one football match. That is precisely why, 40 years later, when British media revisits that afternoon, you can still detect genuine irritation buried underneath every carefully chosen word. Because this was never really about points lost on a scoreboard. It was about the specific, lingering sensation of being deceived on the biggest stage that sport has to offer, in front of the entire watching world, with absolutely no way of ever reversing it afterward. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Maradona's legend only continued growing larger with every passing year. For millions of Argentines, he became something far greater than simply a talented football player. He became a living embodiment of national identity itself, someone who somehow represented both dazzling genius and defiant rebellion within a single human being, a symbol for a people who had always seen themselves as the small nation standing up against a much larger power, the underdog eventually triumphing over the establishment, even if triumphing occasionally required a little deception delivered with a knowing smile, later justified as simply being destiny's way of correcting old wrongs. And perhaps it is precisely this uncomfortable human complexity, this strange, tangled mixture of genius and transgression, heroism and mischief, honesty and deception, all living inside the very same man, within the very same 5 minutes, that transforms this particular afternoon into one of the most endlessly fascinating stories the world of sport has ever produced. Because when everything is finally said and done, what remains permanently etched into the collective memory of football fans everywhere was never simply one goal scored illegally with a hand, or one goal scored spectacularly with magical footwork. What remains, instead, is living proof that football, at its very core, has always been about far more than tactics, formations, and technical skill alone. It has always been about symbols, about national narratives passed down through generations, about humanity's strange, persistent ability to take something as simple as 22 people chasing a ball around a field, and somehow transform it into an entire chapter of shared history between two proud nations. And that is exactly why, even now, so many decades later, whenever someone asks an English football fan about that particular afternoon in Mexico City, the answer they give back is never neutral, never cold, never fully settled. Because that old scar, even though it remains completely invisible to the naked eye, somehow still manages to hurt, quietly, every single time. If this story moved something inside you, if it sparked genuine emotion, curiosity, or maybe even a little outrage, go ahead and drop a comment right below telling us exactly what you thought about it. And please, more than anything else, let us know which city and which country you are watching this video from right now, because honestly, we absolutely love discovering just how far these old football stories manage to travel around the entire world. If you made it all the way here to the end, do us a huge favor and leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing stories exactly like this one for you. And of course, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of the upcoming episodes, because there is still so much incredible, half-forgotten history hidden within the early decades of football, just waiting to be uncovered. Oh, and one more thing before you go. We recently stumbled across a genuinely surprising little product, closely tied to this entire world of football nostalgia, and it is honestly worth checking out for yourself. You will find the link pinned right there in the very first comment below this video. Feel free to click through and take a look whenever it suits you. Because this was far from the only controversy powerful enough to divide entire nations over something that happened on a football pitch, and in our very next story, you are going to discover an even more surprising episode, one filled with hidden decisions, quiet betrayals, and unexpected twists that you may honestly have never heard about before. See you there.